2 years ago, the most recent Fire Emblem game, Fire Emblem Engage, kicked off a kind of pointless controversy with an endless debate over lords and retainers that basically came down to new game bad. But those of us who are veterans of the series remember a decade ago when a different new bad game, Fire Emblem Fates, kicked off a similarly pointless debate, also centralizing around that game's retainers. Although this one was who is the true Jagen of Fire Emblem Fates. In the Revelations route, the most obvious candidate seems to be Gunter, your high-level Great Knight with really bad growths. However, his bases are not actually meaningfully ahead of the other units in your army. Jakob and Felicia, on the other hand, start out in promoted classes, but they gain unpromoted experience gain, and while Jakob can reclass into the traditional Paladin line, you're not guaranteed to have him because your choice of servant depends on your choice of gender. Both Jakob and Felicia also have builds that allow them to scale into the late game, although people who think that disqualifies them should probably take a look at Seth from the Sacred Stones. There is also the argument that Corrin is your Jagen, especially if you early promote them, since they get incredibly over-leveled in the Revelations route, but I've already done a video discussing Corrin, so talking about them here would be repeating myself. If you want to hear my thoughts about the Barefoot Dragon, check out my previous video. Instead, here we are going to discuss the 3 units who devoted their personal skill to bolstering Corrin up. Still more useful than Dwyer's, TBH. This video is part of an ongoing series with the goal to do a deep dive into every single playable unit in Fire Emblem Fates Revelations. Yes, even that one. Despite the fact that the game has a reputation for being terribly unbalanced, I truly believe that every member of the cast can contribute to your team. But units in Fates are highly customizable, and this goes doubly so for Revelations, where each cast member has new options that are not available on their native routes. And so my goal is to go over the multiple potential builds that every member of the roster has. That way, if you want to play through Rev on its highest difficulty, you can utilize whoever your favorite characters are. I'm not going to pretend that all of these units are equally viable. In fact, a secondary goal of the series is to come up with a Revelation tier list. But I really do believe that everyone is at least salvageable and can offer you something unique. While this series is going to be focused around the lunatic difficulty, much of what I say can also apply to the lower difficulties of hard and normal. Those difficulties have lower numbers for the enemies, so it's easier to reach stat thresholds, but things like various reclasses, available friendships, and specific builds that you can go into stay universal despite what difficulty you intend to play on. With all that out of the way, let's dive into our unit review. God, that's either the worst or best series name I've come up with. There's no middle ground. On the surface, Gunter appears to be the most traditional Jagen. He is a level 3 Great Knight who joins you during the first proper chapter of the game, Chapter 7. He's technically not the first promoted unit in your army, as Jakob and Felicia are in a promoted class, but Jakob and Felicia are treated as though they are unpromoted units, whereas Gunter does gain promoted experience, although there's an asterisk attached to this, because he actually gains experience as if he promoted at level 5, which is technically not possible. For those who are not aware, Fates tracks what level you promoted at, and you will gain experience based on that level, faster if you promoted earlier and slower if you promoted later. This means that oftentimes there is a trade-off if you want to get the high-level promoted skills. Promoting early allows you to gain more EXP in the mid and late game. You still do gain less upon promotion than you did unpromoted, but it's treated as if it is a 5-level buffer. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but the long and the short of it is Gunter is going to gain experience as if he is only a slightly higher level than the rest of your units. Or honestly, by the time you recruit him, it's kind of like he's a lower level than the rest of your units, because he joins at the end of Chapter 7, and I find that both Corrin and the Servant are around level 10, 12, maybe even 14 by then. Because of this, both Gunter's experience and his stats do not match what you would expect from a Jagen. He is often outstatted by Corrin, and Corrin is going to be gaining less experience than Gunter would. In fact, I tend to treat Chapter 8 as the Gunter training arc to prepare for Fuga's wild ride. But if we're being honest, the Corrin comparison is unfair. Everyone is going to look bad compared to the best combat unit in the game. So instead, let's look at Gunter side by side some of the scrub squad that joins you at the end of Chapter 8. Tsubaki is a unit who many people consider mediocre, yet when comparing his stat line to Gunter's, he's not all that much less tankier. He has 2 less HP and 1 less point of defense in exchange for 2 extra points of speed and flight. Considering that he's gaining unpromoted experience and has better growths than Gunter, if you want to raise a 7-move tank, I would say Tsubaki is the better option. Heck, Tsubaki's strength is even comparable to Gunter's, at 8 compared to Gunter's 10, so he's going to be dealing almost as much damage, although Gunter does have weapon triangle control, and his base lance rank of C lets him leverage steel for more damage since he wasn't going to double anyway. Although speaking of doubling, if you are using Tsubaki on player phase, he gains extra speed off of Darting Blow, allowing him to double people who Gunter couldn't, often resulting in him outputting more damage than the Great Knight does anyway. A similarly unflattering comparison is Rinka. She matches Gunter's speed and defense with only 4 less HP, and while her strength is 2 points less than his, she can leverage Fiery Blood to bolster it by 4. Although he can also use Elbow Room to boost himself by 3, putting him ahead by 1 overall, but still, it's a pretty close comparison. The biggest thing holding Rinka back is her weapon rank. She's stuck at E rank axes, but all of this is assuming she got no training in the Branch of Fate. Unlike Gunter, she is going to be gaining experience from the 2 chapters she participates in. And while her matchups in Chapter 5 are pretty tragic, in Chapter 4 she's actually quite good against the Faceless, and it's not unreasonable to get a few levels on her, resulting in a unit who is tankier than the so-called Jagen. And even if you don't train her in Branch of Fate, her defense growth is much higher than Gunter's, at 65% to his 25%. So, bare minimum, she will be a better frontliner long-term, and an equal frontliner short-term. Although there's a very distinct possibility she's better at frontlining in the short term as well. The only units who are definitively frailer than Gunter are Kaze and Hana, but both of them are meant to be frail offensive powerhouses as opposed to defensive tanks, so it's not exactly a fair comparison. Hana is going to be dealing less damage than Gunter would at base, but Kaze, especially if you trained him in Branch of Fate, is often going to be outdoing his damage output. And he has perpetual 1-2 range, the ability to debuff, and potentially even Poison Strike. While debuffs and Poison Strike are not super relevant in the other routes, I do think in Revelations, especially early Revelations, they are key. The enemies outstat you by significant margins, and it is hard for even your strongest units to one-round, especially in Chapters 9 and 10. Being able to lower doubling thresholds or increase damage that other people deal is a non-negligible contribution. Hana, on the other hand, is the only combat unit I would say has a worse start than Gunter. They have equal sword rank, so she can't even claim definitive ownership over the unique swords, and her offenses and defenses are both worse than him. She has 3 more points of speed and a much higher strength and speed growth than he does, so if you want to invest in someone to be a damage dealer, she is actually a very good candidate, but from the start, she's not going to be dealing that damage. I don't know how many times I've seen the iconic screenshot of her battle forecast being 0 on Chapter 9, but it is a very pathetic first impression. But honestly, if the only unit who you are outclassing at join time is Revelations Hana, I don't think I can call you a Jagen. Jagens have to have some sort of advantage over the competition. But it's because of this unflattering start combined with truly pathetic growth rates that Gunter is often seen as the worst unit in Revelations cast. And in fact, I've even seen people go so far as to compare him to some of the worst units in the franchise, like Wendy, Sophia, and Milady, who anyone who's played FE6 agrees are trash tier. But this is Fire Emblem Fates. There's far more to units than just their base stats and growth rates. And there are actually quite a few ways to leverage Gunter's unique talents to your advantage. He is the only member of the cast who I don't think has a viable endgame build, but he's around in the early game. Use him in the early game, and use him properly, and he will reward you well. The most obvious and lowest investment utility that Gunter offers is the Great Knight pair-up bonuses combined with Forceful Partner, bolstering Corrin by a significant margin. On pair-up, Great Knight provides 2 strength, 4 defense, and 1 move, and Forceful Partner will give an additional 15 hit and 3 attack, meaning a total of 5 strength, 4 defense, 15 hit, and 1 move on a physical Corrin. But because Forceful Partner bolsters attack instead of just strength, it means that even a magical Corrin could benefit from the +3 to their magical attack. But Gunter also has a phenomenal reclass set, and can become a Wyvern Lord to change that pair-up bonus to be 3 strength, 3 defense, 1 move before Forceful Partner, or Malignite for 2 magic, 2 defense, 2 resistance, and 1 move, again, before factoring in Forceful Partner. Even though Gunter can't build support ranks with Corrin, +3 might and +15 hit is often going to be more than a C or B support would offer from other units. And I usually think that Corrin's best backpack prior to recruiting whoever you plan to marry is Gunter. While Great Knight and Wyvern are generally the most common physical backpack classes for Gunter, he can also go either Hero or Bow Knight if you want to further bolster reliability, as both of those classes give 3 skill and 3 speed, potentially allowing Corrin to reach some doubling thresholds they wouldn't, and providing an additional 4 points of hit on top of the innate 15 from Forceful Partner. Although, I will be real, if you want your Corrin to get more hit out of Gunter, I would say Attack Stance's inherent +10 hit, combined with the 15 from Forceful Partner, for a total of 25 hit is better than having a backpack. But it's nice to have additional options. Of course, all of these options come at a cost. In order to put Gunter in another class just to be Corrin's backpack, you're spending a Heart Seal on him. And while Revelation does give more Heart Seals than the other routes, due to access to both the Rod Stop and the Saf Shop, there's also a lot more units hungry for those early Heart Seals. I've mentioned in my Corrin video, but I think Corrin really appreciates an early reclass, but they aren't the only one. Mozu is basically unusable unless you reclass her to Archer. And while other units are not in such an extreme situation as her, many of them appreciate reclasses depending on the build you're going for. Sakura likes Sky Knight to build Lance rank and gain flight. Felicia appreciates Strategist reclass to make use of her magic in a Tome class line. Sending Hayato Oni helps bolster his defenses and build Axe rank if you want to do Bolt Axe Shenanigans. And Hinata also appreciates an Oni reclass to further accentuate his bulk focus from his personal growths. And even if you're not planning on doing any or all of these reclasses, the extra Heart Seals still cost 2,000 gold if you want to get them before the Fuga map, which you probably do if you're using a Heart Seal on Gunter. After all, Chapter 8 is kind of the perfect Gunter training map if you want to get some skills on him from the new classes that he gets via Heart Seal. And he does have a couple of good options were you to reclass him. My personal favorite is Wyvern. Getting +2 strength really helps his combat, and rally defense is an incredibly helpful tool early on. Combine that with inherent shelter on a flyer, and you have a unit who can do decent combat and very good utility for the early game. In fact, shelter itself is quite rare in early Revelation. The first Cavalier you get aside from Gunter is Silas, who joins you in Chapter 15. This means if you want to take advantage of Shelter Singing, or just have it to assist in your positional efforts, you need to give Corrin the Cavalier talent, or reclass Jakob to Paladin. Gunter comes with it for free, and there is some benefit to having it on a flying unit. The biggest upside is in Chapter 9, when people get blown away by the wind, Gunter can help shelter them to safety, but there are a number of other flight-intensive maps in early game Revelation. Chapter 11 has forests and caltrops that it's really good to be able to fly over. Chapter 12 has a bunch of ships separated by ice, and flight can help to subvert that gimmick. Chapter 13 has an entire river you can fly over, and a similar thing is true of Chapter 14. Technically, there are more flight-intensive maps after this, but I think Gunter is well past his expiration date once you roll around to Chapters 17 and 18. Unless you are doing some very shelter-intensive strategies, you have better options for shelter users at that time, in the form of Silas, Perry, and Xander. Or even potentially Sophie, depending on how you do paralog routing. But speaking of paralogs, that is the other significant downside to using Gunter long-term. Not only do his growths not hold up in comparison to other units, but any map that you deploy Gunter is going to screw with your support routing, due to the fact that he is unable to build supports. I personally value support routing very highly, as it can allow you to get new classes on the units you're using long-term, and even for the units you're using short-term, they can unlock paralogs. Child paralogs will give you access to a Generation 2 unit to add to your army, or simply a large amount of experience to help jump the level curve before particularly difficult missions. And paralogs have an exponential benefit, as you can use new paralogs to build support ranks to unlock new paralogs, and snowball that way. This is particularly helpful if you are trying to pair some of the units who join later in the game, such as Xander or Leo. Many of the paralogs also have higher level enemies than the main chapters, so if you want to get a variety of promoted skills or even the promoted level 15 skills, paralogs are the best way to do it. This is a point that can also be held against Corrin sexuals, but at least they have the option of giving you the Kana paralog and giving some reclass options to specific units, such as Dark Mage Felicia from Flora or Samurai Hayato from Fuga. Gunter isn't even able to unlock the Kana paralog. This is truly a society moment. But just because he's not going to be an all-star during the endgame doesn't mean Gunter doesn't deserve respect for the job that he does early on. Even if you give him no investment whatsoever, as a Great Knight he can do filler combat with the Steel Lance and give Corrin the Forceful Partner skill, while also assisting your army via shelter for shelter singing or positional purposes. If you give him the minimum investment of just one heart seal, he can be a flying shelter rally defense bot who maintains the ability to Forceful Partner Corrin and in fact gives even more damage than he would as a Great Knight. Personally, I wouldn't advise a high investment Gunter due to the fact he lacks support options, but you could always get the cursed combination of rally defense rally skill on a flying shelter bot, I guess, if that's the sort of thing you're into. And if you want to be extra cursed, technically speaking, this game lets you buy twice as many stat boosters as the other routes due to access to both the Rod Shop and Staff Shop, so, I mean, go off Tier 3 Gunter. Although, if you're looking for a servant to do high investment stuff with, Jakob and Felicia are much more viable options in the late game. But before we get to their high investment builds, I do want to talk about the early game performance of the servants. After all, if they are trying to earn the title of Jagen, what they do in the early game is much more important than what they do in the late game. It's kind of impossible to talk about early Jakob and early Felicia separate from each other, because they are competing for a slot on your army. While the servants are not the only factor in choosing Corrin's gender, they are a very significant one. If you go with female Corrin, you will always get Jakob, and if you go with male Corrin, you will get Felicia instead. This is kind of like an Aaron and Samson situation, and hey, that's probably why Jakob has Paladin and Felicia has Hero. But these aren't their base classes. Instead, they start as level 1 Maid and Butler respectively. Felicia is more magically oriented, with slight leads in magic, luck, and resistance, bases, and growths. Meanwhile, Jakob is more physically oriented, with slight leads in the bases and growths of HP, strength, skill, and defense. The two of them are functionally in the same speed tier, although it is worth noting Felicia has 1 extra point at base and a 5% higher growth. So technically, that is her 4th stat that she has a lead in, although it's not by a significant amount. While the differences in base stats and growths on their own are not all that pronounced, the two of them build upon each other, especially when you consider that your maid and servant are likely going to be power leveling in the early game, similar to Corrin, due to the fact that they are the only other non-Asura unit you have at the time. Sure, Felicia and Jakob lack the nobility skill, but they will still gain staff experience from healing Corrin, and combat experience from doing combat. Unless you have them backpacking the Avatar for the entirety of Chapter 7, I think it is reasonable that your servant will also reach the soft EXP cap by the time that Chapter 8 rolls around. And if not then, by the very least in Chapter 9. So, with 10 to 12 level ups under their belt, these growth differences stack with the base differences to become more pronounced than you would expect. And conveniently enough, even without doing calcs, we have an example of what the average stats of Jakob and Felicia would look like at level 13, which is approximately where I estimate they end up by Chapter 9. As you can see, Jakob has nearly double Felicia's strength and a significant advantage in physical bulk in comparison to her. Meanwhile, Felicia has a significant advantage in magic and a marginal advantage in magical bulk compared to Jakob. She has 4 more resistance but 3 less HP, so it comes close to evening out. Felicia also has 2 more points of speed, which can matter when it comes to facing the dangerous ninjas in Chapter 9. Especially after eating a debuff. But otherwise, in most areas that matter, Jakob is just better. He's able to take much more physical punishment, and he can stand up to mages quite good as well. And while Felicia has the luck advantage, Jakob has a skill advantage, meaning that he ends up with more hit than Felicia anyway. The only stat where Felicia has a meaningful lead that I think is significant is magic. 5 extra points is a non-negligible amount, and while the Fates healing formula doesn't really care about your magic stat since it is magic divided by 3, it does mean that reclassing to strategist is a much more reasonable ask for Felicia than it is for Jakob. But aside from that, this kind of seems like a clean Jakob victory. That is, if all you're looking at is stats, because as I mentioned in the Gunter section, in Fire Emblem Fates, there is a lot more to units than their stats. And even in the early game, Felicia has some advantages over Jakob that might not be readily apparent. The most notable of which is her gender. Because while Butler and Maid are technically the same class under a different name, the Troubadour class line that it evolves from actually gets a different level 10 skill depending upon your gender. Jakob has Gentilhomme, which reduces the damage dealt to female units nearby by 2, whereas Felicia has Demoiselle, which reduces the damage dealt to male units nearby by 2. This slight difference is actually very significant when it comes to the early game squad. Both servants will always be able to apply their aura to Corrin, because they are the opposite gender of Corrin. But of the non-avatar units you have available in Chapter 9, Jakob gets to apply his aura to Mozu, Sakura, Azura, Rinka, and Hana. Meanwhile, Felicia gets to apply hers to Gunter, Tsubaki, and Kaze. While Jakob technically wins the quantity of units by 1, Felicia far and away wins in quality. First off, Azura and Sakura are units who really do not want to be doing any combat. Azura should be spending all of her player phase singing and, if possible, staying out of enemy range on enemy phase. Sakura is a staff-locked unit. You can reclass her if you want, but even if you turn her into a combat unit, early on she's just not going to have the bulk to do big enemy phases and benefit from Jakob's aura. Hana is in a similar situation to a Sky Knight Sakura. She is not meant to be an enemy phase god. Even if highly trained, she's not going to get much bulkier. The only unit who really wants to enemy phase that benefits from Gentilhomme is Rinka. In general, I think Rinka is one of the lower quality units you have in the early game, but if you are using her, her defense is definitely her biggest boon, so being able to bolster that with Jakob is nice. However, Felicia gets to bolster Tsubaki and Gunter, both of whom are also amazing frontliners, at least by Chapter 9 standards. And while Kaze does face similar issues to Hana in terms of being somewhat frail and not loving enemy phasing, his incredibly high speed as well as inherent 1-2 range allows him to leverage guard stance in order to be significantly bulkier than the numbers would make you believe. And those extra 2 points of reduced damage go a long way towards ensuring that he is able to enemy phase 1 or 2 enemies in Chapter 9. 1 or 2 doesn't sound like a huge number, but Chapter 9, your units are not enemy phasing particularly well, and we will take what we can get. So, at least as far as Chapter 9 is concerned, you're choosing between a unit who can 1-2 range an enemy phase on his own, or someone who assists others in enemy phasing slightly better. Personally, I think it's better to get your own competent unit than someone who's going to assist the others, because Kaze, Tsubaki, and Gunter are still able to do decent combat without Felicia's help. That 2 damage aura can't be understated, but it also shouldn't be overstated. Kaze can still take on 1 to 2 enemies, he just needs to select the right ones. Same with Tsubaki and Gunter. But the early game doesn't end at Chapter 9. In fact, very quickly you get handed large numbers of other units to play around with. Notable beneficiaries of Demoiselle are Hayato and Hinata. As a mage, Hayato appreciates the bulk boost in the same way that Kaze does, because it pays extra dividends for him as he wants to 1-2 range. Hinata doesn't benefit as much as his 1-2 range brethren, but he is a unit who focuses on bulk and so appreciates any bolster he can take advantage of. And in the same vein, Oboro really appreciates being able to leverage Gentilhomme from Jakob. Each of the servants also gets another ninja, Kagero for Jakob, and Saizo for Felicia, and when Chapter 13 rolls around, Jakob gets Camilla and her 2 retainers, whereas Felicia gets access to both of the furries. I still think Felicia's aura is going to do more work for you at most points of the early and mid game than Jakob's, but the longer you get into the game, the less lopsided the comparison becomes, and Jakob does have quite a few Gentilhomme partners that he can target. Meanwhile, assuming that neither of these units class change, Jakob's combat is just going to continue to get better than Felicia's. You don't get a droppable flame shuriken in this route, so you have to wait until the Chapter 14 shop and then spend money on one. This is a noticeable damage buff for Felicia, but it doesn't do anything about her frailty. And it comes at a time when other units can also do significant magical damage. Don't get me wrong, Flame Shuriken is a very good solution to the generals on Chapter 14, but you could also purchase a hammer at the same time. Spending 3,300 gold to bolster Felicia's offenses shortly before you get some of the strongest pre-promotes in the game doesn't feel like a winning proposition to me. Especially not when Jakob's offenses have been doing work for the entirety of the early game. Yeah, they're starting to fall off now, and you can't fix them without significant investment in him either, but if you bench him without spending any resources, similar to Gunter, I think you appreciate that. In fact, I would argue that he's done more work for you for less investment than Gunter, because he doesn't require a heart seal to get half of his kit online. He just ends up as a 1-2 range unit who can juggernaut and self-sustain through live to serve while supporting some of your team members on turns where he doesn't need to do combat. I call that a certified W. This low investment build is the reason that I personally prefer early Jakob to early Felicia, but it's not the only thing you can do with the world's most asshole-ish butler. Because while their growth rates are not the best, Jakob and Felicia share a special trait that highly incentivizes making them into long-term investment units. And that is the fact that they start out in a promoted class, but gain unpromoted experience. This not only bolsters their growths by a little bit because promoted classes have better growth than unpromoted classes, but also allows them to access promoted skills significantly earlier than other units would, especially the level 15 skills. And as a result of this, these units have a number of very interesting late game builds that can come online as early as the mid game with proper planning. They're all very high investment, but they're also incredibly interesting. So let's take a look. Okay, since I spent the entire no investment segment gassing up Jakob, I think it's only fair to give Felicia some time in the spotlight. And one of her first options isn't even something I would label as high investment, mostly just requiring an early heart seal. Since you have 2 Dragon Vein points by Chapter 8, you can spend 1 on a weapon shop and 1 on a staff shop in order to get Felicia into Strategist and buy her either a Fire Tome or a Rat Spirit. I would recommend Fire, but they're not all that different from each other, TBH. As a strategist, Felicia is going to be even frailer than as a maid, but the trade-off, she hits on resistance, and as a result can actually deal meaningful damage, in particular to enemy Onis, which can be quite tricky for anyone in your army to damage. Because Felicia spends the first couple of chapters in Mage, she kind of gets Live to Serve for free, but I actually don't think that skill is particularly good on her, simply because she is so frail that oftentimes she's not going to want to enemy phase and self-sustain. Felicia's not always going to die when facing a counter, but she often will, especially with the increased enemy quality of Revelation. But a lot of enemies lack access to 1-2 range, and those that do are often using tomes instead of shurikens. And as a result of this, Felicia is often able to initiate combat in an advantageous situation so as to not face any counterattacks. Continuing along the strategist line, she will eventually get Inspiration in order to function as a player phase combat unit combined with the utility of Inspiration, Demoiselle, and Rally Resistance, alongside some decent staffing. Not half bad if you ask me. Although, if you want to further invest in strategist Mage Felicia, you can give her a marriage to one of the other magical characters, in order to give her access to either the Diviner line, the Shrine Maiden line, or the Dark Mage line. Hayato is the earliest marriage, so if you want to get Felicia's damage pumped up in the early game, his would be the option. Unfortunately, I think the Diviner line is probably the weakest options for Felicia, although given her promoted status, she can at least nab an early tome fare if she chooses to go Omnioji. Shrine Maiden also gives her this, although Azama joins so much later than Hayato, I would really only try marrying him if you're trying to turn Felicia into a Rallybot. Of course, another potential option is Dark Mage, which she can grab from a Leo or Odin marriage, and Felicia is one of Leo's best wives, so if you're planning on using him, this marriage is definitely worth considering. The only problem is Leo, much like Azama, joins significantly later than you would want Felicia to get married. If you're trying to take advantage of her promoted skills and early access to them, you generally want to get her reclasses as soon as possible. Plus, she does technically have a friendship route to Dark Mage through her sister Flora, although Flora joins even later than Leo, so if you want to go Dark Mage exclusively, Leo is the best option for it. However, if you want to take the powerful Tome Fairy skill into Dark Mage, Felicia does technically have a pathing to do that. And while it is true that the Servant's growths are generally behind the competition, Felicia's magic and speed growths are at the very least decent enough to, with the power of early promoted skills, maintain damage all the way through endgame if you simply want her to be a powerful sorcerer. There is, of course, the temptation to look into her Heartseal class to supplement this further. The Mercenary class line traditionally has skills that work really well for either ninjas or mages, since access to 1-2 range incentivizes enemy phasing, and the Mercenary class tree gives you both Strong Riposte and Soul. Strong Riposte adding additional damage on enemy phase, whereas Soul gives you a chance to recover HP, which is exponentially increased the more enemies you fight in a round of combat, since each of them gives you the chance to proc Soul. The general idea is you get a unit who can double everything they face, give them a pair-up partner to supplement their bulk, and give them guard gauge. If you are doubling enemies, then after the first enemy you face, you will only take every other hit, due to the way that guard gauge math works. As a result of this, you double your bulk effectively, and with the ability to proc Soul based on your skill stat, you further supplement your bulk due to the ability to regain health on enemy phase. Traditionally, this is a build referred to as Soul Ninjas, but it is worth noting that it works just as well on mages, if not better. They also have access to 1-2 range, and because they can hit on resistance, there are many enemies that they will deal more damage to than ninjas, and as a result, will regain more HP every time that Soul procs. Unfortunately, I don't think Felicia has the stats to make a Soul Mage build work. Even in Conquest, she's going to struggle for that, and in Revelations, thresholds are significantly higher, because enemies are faster, meaning you need more speed to double them, enemies are bulkier, meaning that you need more attack power in order to recover the sufficient amount of HP, and enemies are going to hit harder, meaning that you yourself need more bulk in order to survive enough enemies for soul to reasonably go off. And this last one is especially disqualifying because, as I've said, Felicia's bulk is just kind of non-existent. Both her HP and defense growths are tragically low. She can tank some mages thanks to a halfway decent resistance growth, but unfortunately, if you're going for a soul mage build, the last class type that you want to fight against are other mages, because you're not going to deal any damage to them, even with damage bolstering skills like Strong Riposte. In the bulkiest mage class Felicia has access to, Dark Knight, she still only has a 30% defense growth and a 55% HP growth, making any amount of bulk a steep uphill climb from her paltry bases. I'll be honest, Revelations is not a game where too many units can reliably enemy phase, so this isn't damning for Felicia. It's more of an indictment of the Soul Maid Soul Ninja build. You have to be pretty special to make it work, and Felicia just isn't that special. If you still want to try and cope the Soul Mage build with Felicia though, I would say you definitely want to get her Hana friendship early on. This gives access to Vantage, which further increases the guard gauge math, and potentially Astra as another RNG skill to further supplement your bulk. If you don't recover HP with Soul, you can at the very least recover guard gauge with Astra. I still don't think it's worth your time, but if you want to try and have fun with it, that would be the direction I would go. But that's not to say there's nothing she can get from the Mercenary class line, because while the earlier skills help to supplement the Soul Mage build, the later ones give Felicia access to something incredibly funny and fairly unique to her. At level 15, Hero gains access to Axe Breaker, which reduces enemy axe hit by 50%. The other branch from Mercenary, Bow Knight, gains access to Shuriken Breaker, which does the same thing for shurikens. And Felicia's base class of Maid gets Tome Breaker at 15, doing the same thing to tomes. I think you can see where I'm going with this. If you can reduce the accuracy of enemies all around you by 50%, you can potentially set Felicia up to survive enemy phases not by being bulky, but by being a dodge tank. Unfortunately, the other three breakers are not as easily acquired for Felicia. Bow Breaker comes from Sorcerer, which she can grab from either Flora Friendship or a Leo or Odin marriage, but all of these come fairly late, as previously discussed. And neither Lancebreaker nor Swordbreaker are accessible to Felicia without Corrin marriage, which is a very limited resource and significant favoritism. Although, if you would like to do this build, it's probably best to marry Felicia yourself. I tend not to consider Corrin marriage when it comes to planning out these builds, because basically everyone can benefit from Corrin marriage, but it is worth noting that for the servants in particular, they're going to be able to marry Corrin faster than anyone else due to the fact that they have a fast support and will automatically build C support during the Branch of Fate. Not only that, but giving them your pick of a level 15 skill fairly early is incredibly beneficial to both Jakob and Felicia. I don't think it should be assumed that you marry your first servant, but it is worth acknowledging that they gain more from it than other units would, or at the very least gain more from it in the early game if that is what you care about. If you're not willing to marry your clumsy maid, then another option to up her avoid is Air Superiority from Tsubaki and Takumi. This gives less than breaker skills would, but has the advantage of stacking with them if the flyer has equipped the weapon that you break. Alternatively, if you're willing to wait until Niall's marriage, you can grab Lucky 7 for a flat 20 avoid boost, which is less than the 30 or 50, but at least unconditional for the first 7 turns. Although, as funny as the Omni Breaker build is, I would hesitate to call it good. Gaining anywhere between 50 and 80 avoid against the correct enemy type is certainly going to help you dodge attacks more frequently than other units would. And I do think dodge tanking is sometimes an underrated strategy. However, one of the things that you need to be a reliable dodge taker is a solid amount of bulk. The best kind of dodge tank is someone who gets 4-hit KO'd and most enemies have a 20 to 30% hit chance on them. Getting hit by 4 30% in a single turn does happen sometimes, but it is incredibly rare, especially if you can supplement your avoid with other things like Guard Gauge, Vantage, Astra, Soul, etc. As previously discussed, Felicia lacks that crucial bulk, and as a result of this, if she gets hit by a single attack, it might be lights out, depending on what enemy it is. Enemies in Rev hit incredibly hard, and as such, whether it's through Soul or through the Breaker build, I think trying to turn Felicia into an enemy phase unit is ultimately very misguided. She shines as a player phase glass cannon, having enough speed to double most enemies, a higher magic stat than Hayato, and early access to additional damage boosting skills in order to nuke everything from orbit. But she gets nuked in retaliation if anything so much as breezes her. And with that in mind, why not lean further into the glass cannon of it all? Because Felicia does get some very interesting options from an early friendship with Hana. Unlike her other options, Perry and Flora, Hana shows up in the early game, and so you can take advantage of early access to level 15 skills from the Samurai line, 2 of which are significant damage bolsters, that being Swordfare from Swordmaster and Life and Death from Master of Arms. This gives her a flat damage boost of 15 if she has a sword equipped. And while I'm not a proponent of purchasing the Flame Shuriken in Chapter 14, you get handed a Levin sword for free, and that is an 11 might 1-2 range magical weapon. Working off of average stats, a Swordmaster Felicia is going to have 40 attack with the Levin sword as a Swordmaster with Swordfare and Life and Death. 42 if you buy the second Levin sword for 3300 in order to forge it to a Levin +1. Combine that with the high speed from Swordmaster and she's doubling most enemies, resulting in frequent 1 rounds. But here's where things get silly, because that magical attack stat is actually enough to one-shot all the unpromoted enemies in Chapter 14. Meaning if you manage to get her a Levin sword in Chapter 14, she can just Vantage sweep significant chunks of the enemies. Or, with support from a Rally Magic, a Meal, and a Tonic, alongside Strong Riposte from the Mercenary line adding an additional 3 damage, and perhaps the Spirit Dust that you get in Chapter 10, Felicia can even Vantage one-shot many of the promoted enemies. And it's not just Chapter 14 that this is true on. If she's doing a lot of combat, in particular against promoted units, then she will gain significant experience in 14 and be able to take advantage of select groups in Chapters 15, 16, 17, etc. If you want to further supplement her ability to Vantage sweep, getting her a Leo marriage so she can take the Levin sword into Dark Knight, a class with an actual magic base, is going to do even more for her, especially since it allows her to pick up Malefic Aura and Heartseeker to supplement damage and accuracy respectively. Or if you feel like being a little bit sillier, have her marry one of the Ninja Brothers, preferably Kaze since he comes earlier so you can build the support sooner. She can then learn Replicate and Vantage Life and Death in attack stance with herself. There is another unit, Orochi, who's able to abuse this build much more effectively, but it also comes online significantly later than Felicia's would. Felicia's magic stat is going to need support in the form of meals, tonics, and yes, stat boosters, and even then, she's not going to be able to mindlessly Vantage attack stance every enemy in her way. But she's able to do it much sooner, and as a result of that, can meet the lower thresholds of the mid-game before retiring the Vantage build to become a glass cannon once again. It's worth noting that this is quite a high investment build. She's going to need multiple support chains and seals in order to accomplish this, as well as grind her sword rank up from E to C in time for Chapter 14. You do get a single early arm scroll, so if you want to just grind it to D and then arm scroll her up, that is a viable option, but this comes at the opportunity cost of, well, your only arm scroll. You could give that to someone else in the early game. Felicia does at least have the advantage of a Sword Heart Seal class, so she can start building rank while she's working on the Hana friendship. She doesn't need to wait until she can access Samurai, and instead just needs a Bronze Sword and a Heart Seal to start building sword rank. But the trade-off here is that you're going to be using yet another seal on her. It's also worth noting that if you choose to go Bow Knight, you can train the bow rank instead and gain access to the Shining Bow, which is also 1-2 range and has higher might, plus a more advantageous position in the weapon triangle since there are more lance enemies in the mid-game than there are axe enemies. The downside to this, of course, is if you want Bowfair, she's going to have to marry Takumi and get it from the sniper line, which means investing more levels before you get all of the offensive skills. Since both Master of Arms and Swordmaster promote from Samurai, Felicia is able to get all 6 skills in just 6 levels. However, because Sniper promotes from Archer, if you are going to get Master of Arms Life and Death and Bowfair Sniper, you need to do that in 8 levels instead of 6. Also worth noting that the Shining Bow is given to you significantly later than the Levin Sword. In fact, it is one of the latest magical weapons given to you, dropped by an adventurer in Chapter 21. So if you want it for the mid-game, you're going to have to pay gold, thus furthering the investment costs in this Felicia build. Although, if you would rather simply invest the marriage and the gold, you can use the Shining Bow to turn Felicia into a different type of player phase nuke, taking advantage of quick draw from the Archer line to supplement her player phase damage and lean into that aspect of her kit. It's less unique and less flashy than the enemy phase Vantage build, but it's also less investment intensive. But on the topic of Felicia's more player phase oriented builds, if you would like to abandon the reliability of Bowfair, Life and Death, and Quick Draw in favor of the Gambler's Call, Felicia does have a very funny proc skill based build. With Hayato Marriage, Felicia can enter the Basara class line, giving her access to the skills Rend Heaven and Quixotic. Rend Heaven is the proc skill with the highest chance in the game, that being your skill times 1.5%. It boosts your damage based on the enemy's strength or magic, depending on whether you are using a physical or magical weapon. Quixotic, on the other hand, is a lot like Life and Death, but for accuracy and proc rates. It gives 30 hit to both you and your opponent, as well as adding 15% to both your proc skills and the enemy's proc skills. But this is more one-sided than it seems because in Revelation, enemies do not actually have any proc skills. But Felicia has access to a great deal many. In addition to Rend Heaven, she has Soul from the Hero class, and based on her friendship, she can access a number of others. With Hana friendship, she can get Astra from the Swordmaster class. With Flora friendship, she can grab Vantage from Sorcerer, or with Perry friendship, she can grab both Luna and Aegis. I don't want to mislead anyone, this is not a strong build. It's high investment both in terms of supports and seals, and the payoff is a walking slot machine who can often fail to reach combat thresholds even if she procs her skills. So this isn't the sort of thing that I would recommend if you want to make Felicia good. But it is absolutely the sort of thing I would recommend if you want to make Felicia silly. And I mean, come on. As the saying goes, better silly than good, right? Ultimately though, whichever path you choose to take with Felicia, turning her into a viable combat unit is going to be a high investment task. The more you pre-plan a run, the more high investment builds you can do, but I typically find that most playthroughs can only afford 2 or 3 builds that require as much investment as these Felicia builds do. If Felicia is one of your favorites and you're dead set on turning her into a combat unit, then I would definitely recommend looking into one of the Vantage Life and Death Levin Sword builds. But it is worth noting that it is quite the expensive build, and it's not going to scale into the late game as well as some other high investment units would. Spending a stat booster, an arm scroll, a heart seal, and 2 partner seals, as well as a magical weapon forge in order to dominate the mid-game doesn't sound like a worthwhile return on investment. If you want to drag her kicking and screaming into the endgame, you can technically purchase 4 Spirit Dusts in Revelation, but like, if you're purchasing 4 Spirit Dusts for 1 unit, at that point, are you doing a solo run? Like, I don't really see any other situation where you would buy 4 Spirit Dusts for the same unit. Of course, there is a significantly less flashy way that the Clumsy Girl can scale better into endgame, and that is by abandoning her combat prowesses in favor of a more supportive role. In addition to Demoiselle, with which she starts, Felicia has access to a couple of interesting support skills through her base class line. She naturally wants to enter the Strategist class, giving her easy access to Rally Res and Inspiration. Inspiration stacks with Demoiselle, giving a 4 damage reduction to any male allies and an additional 2 damage boost to their attack. Combine this with Rally Resistance and she can bolster her allies' magical defenses by 8 alongside their physical defenses by 4. And if you have a build that is spending a lot of turns rallying, it's natural to look at other class options to see if they can stack rallies with the same action. Felicia does have access to rally skill through Bow Knight if you want the combination of skill and resistance. Unfortunately, she doesn't gain any other rallies through friendship, which means that she has stuck at a total of 3 depending on who she marries. She can get strength from Arthur or Keaton marriage, or she can get access to speed significantly earlier through Tsubaki marriage. She can also get magic through Hayato marriage or luck and magic through Azama marriage. Although magic is kind of a non-bow with resistance, you generally don't want to have people using magical damage to fight other magical enemies. On the other hand, it is notable that Azama marriage lets her stack both Rally Luck and Rally Skill on the same unit, for the maximum hit bonus per rally. The only other Generation 1 unit who can attain this without Corrin assistance is Baruka, and she has to get it through Selena Friendship and Azama Marriage. It is also worth noting you can choose any rally you want through Corrin Marriage if you're willing to give her that resource. If you've decided to marry Felicia, then I think the best rally option for her would be defense, to give her both res and defense, stacking for a total of 8 physical and magical avoid for all males. A similar combination of rallies can be achieved by Jacob Shigure with res, speed, and defense, alongside Inspiration and Gentilhomme for female allies, but this is going to come online significantly later than Felicia's, even if the increased rally speed is incredibly desirable. On the other hand, Felicia can abandon the rally plan and double down on auras, by which I mean doubling herself. With a ninja marriage, she gets early access to Replicate, allowing her to bring the combination of Demoiselle and Inspiration to even more units. The ninja line granting her Lock Touch also helps because if you're leaning into the utility role, you don't need to devote as many skills to combat prowess. Although if you would still like Felicia's combat to be serviceable with Ninja Marriage, you can purchase the Flame Shuriken and take advantage of early Shuriken fare to bolster the magical weapon's power. Alternatively, instead of splitting yourself up to spread auras out, you could choose a marriage that gives you an extra one. Amaterasu comes from the Sky Knight or Archer line, so either a Takumi marriage or a Tsubaki marriage would allow you to heal your allies in addition to reducing the damage they take. Since you're already standing within 2 tiles of the people you want frontlining, healing them at the end of enemy phase is going to be beneficial to their ability to continue to frontline on future turns. If you're going for Amaterasu, Tsubaki is probably preferred, both because he joins earlier and because he also provides rally speed, in order to stack with rally resistance and the various auras. I think that mostly covers the notable utility skills that Felicia gets. The only other notable one she has access to is Shelter, although she does have 4 possible ways of grabbing it, either marrying Silas, Xander, or Jacob, or friendshipping Perry. Unfortunately, in Rev, all 4 of these options come quite late, so if you want to have Shelter on your utility Felicia, you're either waiting a long time or you're marrying her with Cavalier Corrin. Still, I don't think Shelter is a super necessary part of her utility builds. Between rallies and auras, Felicia can pretty easily fit 5 skills that work well together onto her build without needing to dip into the Cavalier line. I guess if you're doing combat Felicia, Elbow Room through Parry Friendship could help to supplement her damage output, although that means you're not getting Samurai through Hana Friendship and would either have to marry for it or forego the Vantage build entirely. But looking over the rest of her marriage candidates, I don't think there's any other skills I'm overlooking. Of course, skills are only one aspect of the utility that a unit can offer. Due to Fate's pair-up, it's also important to consider how someone works as a spouse, friend, or mother to other units that you might want to build. Because of the way that Fates' reclassing system works, Felicia is able to give the Troubadour class line to her spouse, her child, and anyone she achieves a friendship support with. Unfortunately, the Troubadour class line is not especially desirable, and the few units who do want it already have access to it in their base class sets. This is kind of a double-edged sword for Felicia. On the one hand, it's undeniably a downside that she doesn't have the utility of passing a cool class set to someone else. But on the other hand, it means she's usually not going to be forced into a marriage that doesn't benefit her for the sake of her spouse. This is something that can happen to the units who start out in especially desirable classes like Ninja or Wyvern. But that's not to say that Felicia offers nothing of value as a support partner. She gives a point of speed at C rank, which stacks with Maid's inherent 3 speed for a total of 4 points of speed, which is a pretty huge swing and can help people to double or not get doubled on its own. If you choose to have her marry a magical unit, she will give a point of magic at A rank and another point of speed at S. Alternatively, if you give her to a physical unit, the 2 points of speed combined with 2 points of res, one from B and one from S, can help facing down opposing mages. I suppose you could also take advantage of the res as a magical unit, but I don't really like mage on mage action. Even if you're not planning on having Felicia and the Avatar marry, the C rank speed support is super relevant for the early game because it gives Corrin a boost of 4 speed alongside the devoted partner bonus of 2 attack and 2 protection. Saizo is a unit who often needs some support both in the speed and resistance department, and Felicia provides him with this wonderfully. And he doesn't even hate the magic bonus she gives because he can potentially leverage his already decent magic stat to do damage with the Flame Shuriken. If you're willing to purchase it, of course. While I don't think he really benefits from being able to enter the Butler class line, if you wanted to pick up some of the skills, it's nice that he can maintain his weapon rank. Tsubaki is a unit in a similar situation, and while he would probably prefer the speed support from his Saizo friendship, especially since Ninja is a better reclassing option, if you do Paralog 1 and Invasion 1 prior to Chapter 9, then he's going to get Felicia marriage sooner than Saizo friendship. And even if you're not planning on marrying them, just getting the C support for the 4 speed can do wonders. And heck, even without the support bonuses, adding 3 speed to Gunter can help him not get doubled by some enemies who otherwise would, bolstering his bulk pretty significantly. But perhaps the unit who benefits the most from Felicia marriage is Leo. At join, he has a paltry 15 speed, which means he's going to need assistance doubling enemies. Heck, against some of the faster foes, he's going to need help just not getting doubled. You should probably have a horse spirit by the time he joins, and if you've planned correctly, you might even have a rally speed. But even with those tools, the 4 speed from a C support Felicia is still going to be quite appreciated. At this point in the game, there are other backpacks that provide 4 speed, such as any of your sword masters, but the additional bonus to magic is something that Leo uniquely appreciates. It is worth noting that at the same time as Leo, you get Xander. He doesn't really appreciate the magic, but he does like the speed boost since he starts at the same paltry 15, and res is his other weak point, so the res that Felicia gives is appreciated. That being said, there are other ways to bolster speed with a backpack, and generally Xander is going to appreciate Ryoma, or even Selena and Charlotte, the old staples from Conquest, more than he does Felicia. But Felicia doesn't just benefit her support partners as a backpack. Her attack stance bonuses are also pretty interesting. She gives a total of 15 avoid, which isn't really worth that much. I don't think Avo tanking is particularly strong unless you were using the breaker skills or named Ryoma. But the 10 dodge she gives, 5 at B rank and 5 at S rank, is interesting. Promoted enemies in Revelation have 2 class skills from their unpromoted class, which means that all enemy berserkers have the gamble skill. Berserkers also have a class bonus of 20 crit, although enemies only get half of this and so they are only given 10. But when combined with gamble, they can be quite threatening, especially because crits from berserkers in the mid-game almost always spell a death. Bronze weapons will give you a little bit of crit avoid, but oftentimes this is not enough to reduce the chances to 0. And with the hyperinflated enemy stats alongside the tighter gold budget, you frequently don't want to use bronze weapons because you want to be able to deal significant amounts of damage to the enemy. Being able to reduce the crit chances by adjacency is a significant benefit, even if it is somewhat situational. It's also worth noting that once you enter Vala, there are frequently smatterings of enemies that have killer weapons, so the extra crit avoid is still beneficial as you enter the late game. There are stronger attack stance bonuses, but there are worse ones as well. Regardless though, there are quite a few people who enjoy having Felicia as their wife. Unfortunately, I can't really say the same for her prospects as a mother. The biggest benefit that she brings to the table is that through skill inheritance, she can give her child a level 15 promoted skill or even a level 5 promoted skill much earlier than they would normally be able to access it. The downside is that because Felicia doesn't have spectacular growths, she's not going to pass the best stats on to her children. For those who are not aware, the Gen 2 units in Fire Emblem Fates do not have fixed personal growths. Instead, they have a set of personal growths that are averaged with the personal growths of their variable parent. For most children, this is their mother, but for male Kana and Shigure, this is their father. Once those 2 sets of growths are averaged with each other, it spits out what will actually be that child's personal growths for this playthrough. Parents can also pass on extra points of base stats due to staff inheritance depending on how high their specific stats are. This stat inheritance is added to the child's personal bases, and then the children are auto-leveled by using the combination of their class growths as well as their personal growths, but specifically the personal growth that was determined based upon their variable parent, in order to determine what their stats will be when you recruit them, since they auto-level to a different point depending on how late in the campaign you are. But I don't think it's necessary to know the exact numbers of these outside of hyper-specific challenge runs. Instead, just having a general idea of what stats are going to be increased or decreased based on the specific mother you give them is generally good enough. For example, knowing that Azura is going to bolster her children's strength and speed but lower their defense can help you choose which child you want her to give birth to based on whose strength and speed you want to bolster. Even if you don't know the exact numbers, you can target specific weak points in order to bolster the units as you wish. Due to her abysmal personal growths, Felicia is going to lower most children's strength and defense quite significantly. It's not unusual for a mother to have a couple of weak points, but Felicia doesn't really have anywhere she excels. Her speed, luck, and resistance are kind of just average, meaning she won't significantly bolster her children in these areas. Felicia clearly wants to be a magical mother, as her personal magic growth is 35%, which is much higher than the 10% she gives in strength. However, her personal magic growth of 35% is really not impressive in comparison to the other magical mothers. Nyx and Sakura both have a 50% magic growth, and Orochi and Elise have 65%. And these units will also bolster other areas better than Felicia does for the most part. Well, with the exception of Orochi, she is really going to tank her children's speed, but that's a topic for a different video. My point is that if Felicia is going to give birth to a child, they are probably not going to be statistically blessed, and so you want to really leverage the skill they inherit to make up for that deficit. One option is to have her give birth to a kid who is going to have good stats regardless. It's kind of hard to screw up Forest or Rajat as long as their mom has a passable magic stat, simply because they have such high magic growths on their own. Even with Felicia Mother, both of them will cap their magic on average and have serviceable speed, although their frailty will be increased because, Felicia's not giving any bulk. Ophelia isn't in quite as extreme a position, and Odin is definitely a worse unit than Leo and Hayato in Rev, but if you're using him and want to marry him to Felicia, Ophelia will be fine? It's a little bit disappointing for Ophelia to just be fine when she has so much more potential, but she doesn't become unusable in the way that some other kids would. The last three notable kids for Felicia Mom are Nina, Amitama, and Asuji, all of whom have kind of hybrid growth rates, and so they can go in either the physical or magical direction. Although I think if they want to go magical, they would much prefer a mother that gives them a significantly better boost than Felicia does. Hilariously, Felicia actually drags down Asuji's magic compared to his personals. She also really hurts these three units' bulk, which doesn't really matter much for Nina or Mitama, but Asuji does not appreciate it since he's trying to emulate his father, even though that isn't what the story tells you. One thing that Asuji and Rajat can appreciate from a Felicia Mother is that their father gives Felicia access to a very strong level 15 skill for them, in Tome Fair and Shuriken Fair respectively. So this can really help to supplement their player phase combat. Alternatively, Felicia can still grab life and death for any of her kids from Hana Friendship, and if they're just trying to be a player phase bot, which let's face it, anyone with a Felicia Mom isn't going to enemy phase, then life and death is a pretty good tool for them. But I think Felicia's best strength as a mother is if you're building a child into a utility unit, because some of the best utility skills are locked behind high-level promoted skills. Most notably, Felicia can pass any utility child the Inspiration skill. So if you just want Forest or Dwyer in a support role, having Felicia sire them can help you in this goal. Alternatively, she can pass Demoiselle down to either of them, since they will naturally learn Gentilhomme. If you are delaying your Forest or Dwyer recruitment long enough that a Offspring seal gives them Inspiration, then being able to stack Gentilhomme, Demoiselle, and Inspiration gives a full +2/-4 to your entire army regardless of their gender. Dwyer is particularly noteworthy in this role because you don't have to delay his recruitment until Offspring seals give level 15 skills. Instead, Jacob can pass Inspiration down and Felicia can pass Demoiselle. The other interesting utility skill that Felicia can pass down to her child is a Rally. She naturally has both Rally Resistance and Rally Skill in her skill set, and whoever she marries will gain access to Rally Resistance if they use a partner seal. Percy naturally has access to Rally Defense and Rally Strength through his base class set. If Felicia passes Rally's skill down to him and Arthur passes Rally Resistance, he can end up as a fairly decent Rallybot, combining Strength, Defense, Resistance, and Skill. Heck, if you want to further this build, Percy's cross-route marriages of Rajat and Mitama both give him access to Rally Magic, and Mitama even adds Rally Luck in for free. The other possible Rallybot that Felicia could pass skill down to is Kana. Kana will naturally inherit the Troubadour class line from Felicia if Felicia is his mother, and Corrin can potentially pass Kana 2 additional rallies, one through skill inheritance and one through their talent. And as a dual route child, Kana has access to a large number of marriages and friendships to supplement this rally set. Regardless of their gender, they can always get at least one rally from their friendship and at least one rally from their marriage. But access to these rallies is not the only reason to have Felicia sire the dragon child, as the fastest possible way to recruit Kana is to marry the early servant. You get C support in Branch of Fate and have a fast support outside of that. Because you can choose Corrin's talent, you are free to give whatever level 15 skill you want to Felicia, and as a result of that, to Kana. Now, Kana's stats are already pretty bad, and Felicia certainly isn't going to help him. But by nature of Corrin's talent being customizable, Kana has the widest selection of inheritable level 15 skills. For other units, they have to get lucky that they want something that will be given to Felicia by their father. But with Kana, you can choose almost any powerful skill to supplement their build. The unfortunate thing about that, however, is most of the level 15 skills are not make or break on their own, and oftentimes they are powerful in combination with either strong stats or other high-level skills, neither of which you can pass down to a Felicia Kana. The weapon fair skills are good, but only if you have good enough stats to do combat. The same is true for other damage stacks like Spendthrift and Life and Death, and oftentimes these damage stacks also want to be combined with other damage stacks in order to make for truly nuclear attacks. Replicate is only good if the unit you're duplicating is doing something worthwhile, and Felicia Kana certainly isn't. The most standout high-level skills on their own are Inspiration and Pass. Pass can allow for some cheesy strategies in a hyper-planned run, but honestly, I don't think there's too many use cases for it in Revelation. Meanwhile, Inspiration is a skill that Felicia can pass down to any child. The only advantage of giving it to Kana is that Kana is going to show up slightly earlier than Felicia's other Inspiration children. But do you really need 2 Inspiration bots in the early game? Felicia is already going to have Inspiration and work really well as a utility healer if you reclass her to Strategist. Why bother with the Kana marriage at that point? Corrin marriage is such an important resource that wasting it just to give Kana Inspiration feels bad. It feels really bad. As a result of all of this, I think Felicia's marriage should first and foremost be focused on benefiting herself and her husband. And in most cases, it's best to just throw her child on the bench, rather than trying to make a workable Felicia Jr. If you do want to make her child a core part of your team, then Jakob marriage and Leo marriage are probably your best bets. But because of how late those 2 units join, you don't necessarily need to do early Felicia if you want her to mother Forrest or Dwyer. And with that in mind, I do want to take a look at late Felicia, because throughout this video I've been talking about her as if she joins you in Chapter 2 and then once again rejoins in Chapter 6, but that's not always going to be the case. Remember, Jakob versus Felicia is an Aaron versus Samson. If you choose to go female Corrin, you're going to end up with early Jakob. But Felicia does eventually rejoin you. Late Felicia, as she's referred to by the community, joins as a level 13 maid at the end of Chapter 15, just in time for the linked chapters of 16 and 17. This point in the game is very notable for 2 things in Revelation. First is the enemy quality skyrockets significantly. These are the last 2 main story maps to have any unpromoted enemies, and the promoted enemies are both more common and more fearsome than in previous chapters. Heck, even the unpromoted enemies can do some great damage to your units if you're not careful. The second is that these chapters give you a metric shit ton of new units to train up. You get 4 new royals in the form of Leo, Xander, Ryoma, and Hinoka, alongside 6 retainers. Not only that, but Chapter 18 is the earliest point at which you can recruit Fuga, although you do have to do a map in between 17 and 18 for him to join you. Technically, you also recruit Scarlet at this point, but let's just say she's not going to be fighting for deployment slots for too much longer. With all of these new options for your army, it can sometimes feel a little bit questionable to add the second servant to your team. Leo, Hinoka, Ryoma, Xander, and Fuga are all exceptionally strong out of the box, and if what you're looking for is a training project, then the 6 retainers are going to give you a better return on investment than late Felicia would. But I wouldn't say there's no reason to use late Felicia as a member of your team. She auto-levels both hidden weapons and staves to C rank. This means she gets to skip the physical grind and can just use a flame shuriken if you're willing to spend the money, but more importantly, C rank staves is a trait that not too many units in your army have, and Felicia's skill and magic are passable enough that she can be a decent staffer. Staffers are already at fairly low supply in Fates, but in Rev it's seemingly an even worse situation. You get Sakura early on, although she often wants to reclass out of Shrine Maiden, and if you're getting late Felicia, then you also got early Jakob, but he's not going to be as good of a staffer as Felicia is. Elise shows up as a level 7 troubadour 2 chapters prior to Felicia joining, with D rank staves instead of C. Truly pathetic. And Azama shows up on the same map as Felicia, and he not only doesn't have a particularly good magic stat, but also would much rather focus on combat than utility. The same is true of Shura, who joins in the middle of chapter 15, but has a lower staff rank than Felicia, and also would much rather do combat if you're using him. Flora is also available in Rev, but she joins significantly later than in Conquest and does not receive any buff for the later join time. And she was already a pretty mediocre unit in the Conquest route. Your only other options for staffers are the 2nd generation units, most notably Forest, Dwyer, and Mitama, but Forest and Mitama are going to come quite late, and Dwyer is he's not going to be great unless you give him a very good mother. Because of this, rather than bothering to train a staffer in the early game, you can kind of just let Felicia show up at the end of chapter 15 and be good enough. Especially if you're planning on marrying her to Leo, she can spend most of the time in his saddlebags and only come out for staffing when necessary. It's also worth noting that Felicia is only 2 levels away from a promoted 15 skill, and she's still going to be gaining unpromoted experience, so she will gain these promoted skills quite quickly. Late Felicia is therefore still one of the faster ways of getting the inspiration skill, further adding to her filler utility. While she's not competing with the all-stars that join around her like Ryoma and Xander, she's definitely better than most of the retainers that join in the 2-chapter stretch. The only one of them I would say is definitely better than her is Laszlo. Late Felicia's not going to give you the high highs of a super heavy investment early Felicia, but I also don't think that heavy investment is necessarily warranted by early Felicia, and late Felicia is still able to do the filler utility job with occasional magical combat. Don't get me wrong, late Felicia is definitely worse than early Felicia. The availability kinda sucks on its own, but it also means she has less opportunities to build supports. But one of her best support partners joins at the same time as late Felicia. So it's not a huge deal if you're planning on marrying her to Leo anyway. She's an incredibly usable, if unexciting unit, which is more than I can say for the late version of her counterpart, Jakob. But before we get to that, I should dive into what Jakob's performance in the early game looks like, because it is drastically different from Felicia's in some interesting ways. If you are turning early Jakob into an investment project, the first thing to consider is his Heartseal class line, that being the Cavalier tree, allowing him to access either Paladin or Great Knight immediately. Great Knight is a slightly bulkier class, but Paladin has an extra point of movement and a more desirable level 5 skill in Defender. This skill gives you +1 to all stats as long as you are in the guard stance, aka paired up. While it is undeniably useful, especially if you want to bring some of the Paladin skills into another class later down the line, I think Defender is somewhat overrated by segments of the community, as oftentimes the +1 is only relevant for some stats. If you're already doubling, the +1 speed doesn't matter, and +1 magic isn't going to matter at all if you're just doing physical combat. The defense and strength are also situational depending on what thresholds you meet without Defender. Especially for a unit like Jakob, who is going to have access to far more skills than the average member of your army, it can be difficult to fit Defender into the 5 slots you have available. Usually, it feels like it comes at the expense of something more impactful. But Defender isn't the only skill from the Cavalier class line that Jakob appreciates access to. Elbow Room is a nearly unconditional damage boost, giving +3 as long as the space you are on does not have any terrain effects, and Revelation is full of unterrained tiles. Meanwhile, Shelter is useful on Jakob for all of the same reasons that it is useful on Gunter. While it's not as easy for Jakob to enter a flying class as a shelter bot, he's still plenty capable of sheltering from the ground. If you're trying to pull off shelter sing shenanigans, 2 shelter bots is going to be better than 1, but even if you're not planning on do that, getting shelter on Jakob is nice because he has better long-term potential than Gunter does, and if you're spending a heart seal on Jakob anyway, you're probably trying to invest in him long enough to drag him through the rest of the game. Unfortunately for Jakob, the rest of the promoted Cavalier skills are pretty bad. Luna and Aegis are chance-based skills that are neither impactful enough nor reliable enough to build strategies around, and the only other one is Armored Blow from level 15 Great Knight. It gives plus 10 defense when initiating combat, which is pretty cool since it can allow you to eat a counterattack that you wouldn't otherwise. But I think a bulk boosting skill that is only effective on player phase feels like a bit of a waste. If you're investing in a unit's bulk, you kind of want them to be able to handle large enemy phases, as opposed to leveraging that bulk on player phase. And I think this is especially an issue on Jakob because he can pretty easily attack enemies without taking any damage if you just leave him in the Butler class, due to the fact that hidden weapons have perpetual 1-2 range. Armor blows could help a Butler Jakob in player facing a single enemy ninja, but other than that, if you really want to focus on Jakob's player phase, Armored Blow is not going to be the most valuable tool he can access. Instead, we want to look towards the classes he can gain from his support chains, and much like his counterpart Felicia, Jakob has an early friendship he can get, that being with Takumi, giving him access to the Archer class line. Takumi joins 2 chapters later than Hana, meaning that Jakob's friendship will be slower than Felicia's, especially if, like me, you like doing Mozu's Paralogue and Invasion 1 prior to chapter 9. If you want to get Jakob into the Archer line sooner than that, you can have him marry Mozu, who will pass it on to him. However, Archer is the only class line that Jakob can access through friendship, as his other one with Silas will just give him Cavalier, which he already has access to. Therefore, I would advise against marrying Jakob to Mozu, both from a gameplay and ethical perspective. Regardless of how you attain it, Archer is a very good class that can give Jakob some pretty desirable skills. Quick Draw is plus 4 damage on player phase, and when combined with Certain Blow and Bowfare from Sniper, Jakob can deal a hefty amount of damage in the mid-game using even Bronze Bows or Brass Yumis. While his strength and speed scale worse than the other archers you have available, he can make up for it with access to promoted skills much sooner than them, especially if you got it via Takumi friendship, since you can then dip into another class set for promoted skills that supplement Archer. And very early on, Jakob has 2 marriage options that supplement the Archer class set, that being Sky Knight from Azura or Samurai from Hana. With the combination of Elbow Room, Quick Draw, Life and Death, and Bowfare, Jakob can gain a total of 22 damage purely from the skills he has equipped, meaning that even with his mediocre strength stat, he becomes a player phase nuke. Of course, the downside of Life and Death is that you take 10 more damage as well, but if you were just shooting people on player phase, this downside isn't super relevant. Although, I will say this is less free on Jakob than it is on Felicia. Felicia tends to be frail enough not to face any enemies in the mid-game anyway, but Jakob can usually take a hit or 2, at least from the unpromoted foes, and even as an archer if he's not countering, just being able to tank a hit is valuable. Life and Death changes that, and so while it makes him better at deleting foes, it also makes him better at getting deleted. So instead, personally, I prefer the Sky Knight class line, as that can help to supplement Jakob's speed by giving him access to Darting Blow, potentially pushing him past some doubling thresholds. And the nice thing about this is if you send Jakob Kinshi Knight, he gets the Sky Knight skills for free, due to the way that skills from branch promotions work. Jakob still maintains a 12 damage stack from Elbow Room, Quick Draw, and Bowfare. And if the plus 5 AS from Darting Blow allows him to double, then potentially this gives him more damage than Life and Death would anyway. Whichever direction you go with it, these builds only require 4 skills each, giving you room for either Certain Blow, Defender, or Shelter. Although personally, I think Certain Blow is the best one of these if you want Jakob to be a bow-wielding nuke. Of course, there is another weapon type he can use to kill enemies at 2 range without counter, and that is shurikens, the weapon that he starts with rank in. Through Kagero marriage, Jakob can acquire the ninja class line, allowing him to bolster his shuriken skills with shuriken fare. Combining this with the boosts he gets from Elbow Room and Defender, Jakob can actually potentially enemy phase as a ninja. Although if you would prefer to focus on the player phase combat, Quick Draw is still available from Takumi Friendship. And since you've done all this work to stack late game skills on Jakob, you might as well get 2 units with late game skills, so Replicate lets you clone your Jakob, running around with 2 powerful Master Ninjas, or potentially 2 Butlers, because Jakob's combat as a Butler is fairly comparable to his combat as a Master Ninja. In fact, as a Butler, he is both physically and magically more bulky than as a Master Ninja, and he can supplement this bulk with self-sustain from Live to Serve. Live to Serve is especially helpful on a Replicate Jakob, because you can either heal twice in order to heal yourself more, or heal with one replica and attack with the other one if you need to continue making progress. The main advantage that Master Ninja has over Butler is its speed, which can actually be relevant for some of the faster late game enemies such as Sword Masters and Ninjas. Although if you really need to patch up Jakob's speed, he's already married to Kagero, that means he has a +5 speed backpack ready to go. But Kagero marriage isn't only relevant to Jakob as a combat unit. If the reason you are investing in Jakob is to turn him into a utility unit, then Replicate can be highly helpful here as well. Even though he's not as magically oriented as Felicia, Jakob can still dip into Strategist to grab the inspiration skill. He can combine this with Gentilhomme, which he has from base, and Amaterasu, which he learns from Takumi Friendship, to be a utility unit with 3 auras built in. In case you need a refresher on what those skills do, Inspiration boosts allies within 2 tiles by +2 attack and -2 damage taken. Gentilhomme reduces damage dealt to female allies within 2 tiles by 2, and Amaterasu recovers HP of allies within 2 tiles by 20% at the start of every turn. The 3 of these synergize with each other very well because the 2 damage reducing ones you want to apply to people who are going to be enemy phasing a bunch, and then if those people are enemy phasing, they'll take some amount of damage, which Amaterasu can help heal off. Replicate then allows him to spread those auras to more units, although it is worth noting that a single aura will not stack with itself, so he cannot give inspiration to the same unit twice for a +4 damage buff. Instead, the purpose of Replicate on this Jakob is to allow your army to split up on the many maps where doing so is beneficial, such as Chapter 18, Chapter 20, Chapter 21, etc. Since this build only calls for 4 specific skills, the 5th slot is free to be filled with whatever you desire. You already get Rally Resistance for free, and while it's not the most useful rally in isolation, there are a lot of tome users in Revelation, so if Jakob is already reducing damage with Inspiration and Gentilhomme, he can add 4 more to that against magical enemies. Alternatively, you grab Lock Touch on the way to Replicate, and there are actually a few maps where deploying multiple Lock Touch users is quite useful. The ones that come to mind to me are Chapter 21 and Chapter 23 specifically, although if you are trying to stealth Chapter 24, that is also a good place for multiple Lock Touchers. Between Shura and the ninjas, there's no shortage of strong Luck Touch units in Rev, but this can allow them to equip more useful skills while still letting you get all of the treasure efficiently. If you are particularly adept at shelter singing, then shelter can be a good option, giving you 2 shelter pots for the price of 1. And if none of those are useful on the map, you can give Jakob Tomebreaker just to keep him safe while he's providing auras to other units. The nice thing about this as well is you can sort of swap these skills in and out depending on what would be most useful on the map you're currently on. It's also worth noting that Jakob's role as a support unit doesn't need to be separate from his role as a combat unit. I've run Shuriken Fair, Replicate, Inspiration, Lock Touch on Jakob, and while his combat is definitely worse with this combination than the builds that purely focus on his combat, it is still fine as a filler combat unit and allows him to still fill that utility role. I do think it's generally better to focus on one or the other, but depending on the needs of your army, mixing and matching isn't going to make him unusable. Now, I think Kagero is pretty clearly Jakob's best wife, both from a combat and utility perspective, but Jakob doesn't really offer much to Kagero. The biggest upside that she gets is it's infinitely funnier for her to one round as a maid than as a mechanist. And Kagero herself is a highly desirable wife, as she is the only way to give ninja to the male units who don't already have it outside of Korin marriage. So since Kagero might not always be available to Jakob, I want to take a look at the other options offered to him by potential wives. I briefly touched upon Hana for Life and Death for the Archer build, but she can also potentially pass both Vantage and Astra to Jakob if you want a discount Ryoma for the early game. I generally think that by the time you get this skill combination, Jakob's not going to have good enough combat to make use of it, but your mileage may vary. The only other notable skill Hana offers is Swordfare, which Jakob can take back into Paladin if you want to lean into the horsey boy vibe, but again, this isn't something I'm particularly fond of. Sakura marriage is kind of interesting. She offers him the monk class line, which could give Jakob the cursed rally combination of luck, magic, and res, but I think is more notable for allowing him to reclass into Great Master. Great Master has pretty decent class bases and growths, and allows Jakob to retain staff access so he can make use of Live to Serve to increase his self-sustain. Not only that, but the Renewal skill will heal him 30% HP at the start of every turn. Great Master using lances is also relevant if you early reclass to Paladin, because Jakob can train his rank using Azura's Bronze Lance in Chapter 7, and then is able to retain that lance rank in Great Master. A similar thing is true of Basara, which he can access through either Orochi or Oboro marriage. And Basara gives access to Rend Heaven and Quixotic. This allows Jakob to use a gambling build similar to the one I mentioned earlier with Felicia. He can use Rend Heaven and Quixotic in combination with the two proc skills from his native class line, Luna from Great Knight and Aegis from Paladin. Aegis is a skill percent chance to cut damage from bows, tomes, daggers, breath, ballista, or dagger stones in half, and Luna is a skill percent chance to cut the enemy's defense in half. None of these proc skills are particularly good. As I mentioned during the Paladin section, I don't find them to be reliable enough or powerful enough to add to a build, and the boost from Quixotic is not enough to change that, but this is an incredibly funny skill layout, and funny is oftentimes better than good. You invest a ton into Jakob, and he's still absolutely shit, but sometimes he'll proc Rend Heaven and deal 0 more damage. Of course, there's a slightly more reliable skill he can get from Oboro marriage in Lance Fair, which he can take back into Paladin, similarly to Sword Fair, but I don't think this is terribly exciting or worth the marriage slot. Through Rinka marriage, Jakob can access the Oni line, which is an incredibly rare class line. And while most of its skills don't offer much for him, Salvage Blow is at least interesting, if not particularly good. Whenever you kill an enemy, you have a luck percent chance to be given an iron variant of the weapon they had equipped, unless it was a magic weapon. You can either use these weapons for forging or sell them for extra gold, which is somewhat tight during the early game of Rev. However, because this is a luck percent chance, it is inherently unreliable. Jakob does actually have a reasonable luck base and growth, so it's not like this is never going to happen, but even then, the money you get from selling iron weapons is not particularly extreme, and in fact, it's going to take you a while just to make up for the gold you spent on a partner seal, let alone the amount of time it takes to make a profit. And all of these kills that you feed to Jakob are kind of wasted experience, because Jakob's prospects as a long-term unit kind of go out the window when you make him into an Oni. As a general rule, the Nourian classes become available later than the Hoshiden ones, but Jakob does have some interesting options if he's willing to wait for a bride. Both Felicia and Selena give him access to the Mercenary class line. As I mentioned with Felicia, Merc skills actually synergize really well with classes that have inherent 1-2 range, so the temptation to get Quick Riposte and Soul and send Jakob as a Soul Butler is there, but the thresholds to make this build work in Revelation are so high that I simply don't think Jakob has what it takes, especially if he's spending his marriage getting the mercenary skills, so he can't supplement his bulk or his offenses with skills from other classes. As such, instead of hero, I think Bow Knight is the more interesting get for Jakob, since Jakob already has both Kinshi and Sniper available from Takumi friendship. Grabbing Bow Knight through his marriage allows him to combine the 3 best bow classes with each other: Kinshi Knight for flight, Archer for stats, and Bow Knight for grounded movement. The mercenary variant of Bow Knight is slightly less desirable than the Outlaw one, because Outlaw would give him +1 move, whereas Strong Riposte is not particularly useful if you're trying to be an offensive player phase bow user. And unfortunately, there are no non-Corrin units who can give Jakob access to the Outlaw line. But even so, this combination of classes work really well together, making Felicia and Selena some of his better marriage options. Which is good because there's not much else the Nation of Nor has for Jakob. The Knight line from Effie is useless, and Charlotte gives him an alternate way to access Soul from Hero, trading Strong Riposte for HP +5, but for the same reasons I don't like it from Mercenary Marriage, I'm not a huge fan of Hero from Charlotte Marriage either. On the surface, it would seem like Nyx Marriage offers absolutely nothing since Jakob is not a magically inclined unit, but Life Taker from Dark Knight is kind of interesting. Whenever a unit with Life Taker gets a kill on player phase, they will recover 50% HP, making it one of the strongest sources of self-sustain in the game. However, as nice as early Life Taker is, I don't think a Jakob who spends his marriage acquiring it is going to have a sufficient enough combat to make use of it all that often. Jakob really needs to get skills from a strong marriage in order to supplement his combat going into the late game. Dark Mage does also offer Heartseeker to give adjacent enemies -20 avoid, and Malefic Aura to make enemies within 2 tiles take 2 more magical damage, so theoretically Jakob could add these auras to his collection, but they don't really stack super well with the ones he already has, since those auras affect your allies, and Heartseeker and Malefic Aura affect enemies, making positioning for them different. But I don't know why I'm talking around it. If you are delaying Jakob's marriage in order to get a Nourian class, there's a 90% chance that the one you're going for is Wyvern. Wyvern is a generically good class that a lot of units want to enter, both because it flies and has good bases, and because it offers a decent set of skills, especially for the likes of Jakob, who can gather the powerful promoted skills far sooner than others would. The unpromoted Wyvern skills are Strength +2, which is pretty self-explanatory, and Lunge, which allows you to initiate an attack that will swap your space with that of the opponent. Lunge is a situationally useful skill. Maps like Chapter 9, Chapter 13, and Chapter 18 have a lot of narrow corridors, which can lead to you wanting to shuffle enemies around in these choke points. Additionally, if you are having multiple units gang up on a tanky enemy like Rev Generals, then being able to move enemies around to assist with your positioning can be nice. But the real big value comes from the promoted Malignite skills. At level 5, Malignite gets Savage Blow, which deals a flat, non-lethal 20% damage to all enemies within 2 spaces after you initiate an attack, and that includes the attack's target if they survive. This can be nice for setting up kills if you're trying to train projects, especially if you've class dipped into a class they're not super competent in, such as making a mage enter Master of Arms for Vantage in Life and Death. But even outside of that, Rev enemies are very bulky. The extra 20% as an AoE splash damage can help some of your other units meet benchmarks they wouldn't otherwise. I think Savage Blow is at its most valuable in Rev because this is the route where it is hardest to one-round foes. But the capstone skill of the Malik class, and honestly of the Wyvern tree, is Trample, which gives a +5 damage stack if you are fighting an unmounted foe. This is the same boost that a Weapon Fair would give, and there are a surprisingly few number of mounted enemies in Revelation. The mid-game features a good number of Paladins in chapters 13, 14, and 17, and the late game has some flyers, specifically in chapters 20, 22, and 23, and the right-hand side of endgame features mounted classes, but aside from that, you are going to be facing mostly infantry outside of specific paralogs. Depending on how many seals you're willing to spend on him, Jakob can combine this damage stack with the ones that he gains from the Archer and Cavalier class lines. Elbow Room, Trample, and Quick Draw is a total damage stack of 12. And if your plan is to stick Jakob in a bow class, you can add Bow Fair to bring it up to 17. The nice thing about Wyvern Marriage in comparison to Ninja as well is Jakob has 3 options for it, in Camilla, Baruka, and Elise. And Elise is especially relevant because normally she gives out the undesirable Troubadour class line. But because Troubadour is Jakob's base class, he gets to steal the Wyvern class from her instead. Unfortunately, unlike in Conquest, Elise is not an early marriage option for Jakob. She actually shows up a chapter after Camilla and Baruka do. But if you were trying to turn your entire squad into Wyverns, the Jakob-Elise marriage does give you that option. And as a bonus, it will also pass Wyvern down to Dwyer. Cards on the table, I'm not a huge fan of Wyvern Jakob. It takes a good amount of investment just to bring him up to par with the rest of your combat units. Getting early access to the damage stack skills is impressive, but considering how late his Wyvern marriage options show up, he's going to be getting those damage stacks pretty late into the campaign anyway. And at that point, many other members of the cast could achieve the same level of damage as Jakob using the combination of raw stats and the damage stacking skills they have access to. Remember, stuff like Quick Draw and Elbow Room are unpromoted skills, and even the level 5 skills are going to be accessible to the wide variety of the cast by the time you get Jakob into Wyvern. Well, unless you get Jakob into Wyvern during the mid-game, because there is one marriage option I've been dancing around, and it can give Jakob much earlier access to the coveted Wyvern and Ninja class lines, that being Corrin. Much like his female counterpart, Jakob has an incredibly fast Corrin marriage, building C in the Branch of Fate and having a fast support for the rest of it. If you focus down and decide to make Jakob your husband, you can have him in Wyvern or Ninja by chapter 10, which is actually quite convenient timing because Takumi joins at the end of chapter 10, allowing Jakob to immediately pivot towards building his friendship skills. Of course, Corrin isn't limited to just giving Ninja and Wyvern to Jakob. You can choose whatever talent you want to pass on to him, but honestly, I think those are the only 2 that he really wants. Any other relevant class, and Jakob can reach it pretty quickly without wasting your Corrin marriage. In fact, the only class that he can't access at all without Corrin is Merchant, and Merchant doesn't really offer that much for him. Early Profiteer is a slightly different way to cope on money than Blacksmith is, but I feel like it's unadvisable for basically the same reasons I advised against Blacksmith. And it's even worse here because you're spending Corrin marriage on it. But marrying Corrin to Jakob does have one advantage beyond giving Jakob class access early. And that is, it gives you 2 paralogs for the price of 1 support chain. You see, while Felicia was female and therefore the variable parent for most pairings, Jakob is male, and as a result of that, there are not that many kids that he can influence as a father, which is good because he's kind of a shit dad. Now that's what I call story gameplay integration. Because Jakob is Dwyer's fixed parent, he actually won't influence Dwyer's stats, but he can pass down a promoted skill to him, which, as I talked about with Felicia, is less impactful than you would think. I think the premier inheritance skill would be inspiration for a utility dwyer. But slightly more interesting are the two marriages where Jakob gets a second child, because he is the variable parent to both Kana and Shigure. Kana is an incredibly tragic child, due in large part to the combination of his underwhelming stats and disappointing class set, and unfortunately Jakob doesn't help in either of these departments. Troubadour line is not something that Kana desires, and the only stat that Jakob increases over Kana's personals is HP. All of the others Jakob drags down, and Kana's personal growths were already bad. Just like Felicia, Jakob can pass down a level 15 skill to Kana, but this is not nearly enough to fix all of the problems that my worthless son has. Shigure, on the other hand, is an interesting case, and Jakob is weirdly one of his better fathers. Although to explain why, I need to delve into the parental inheritance mechanics. Second generation units will always have three classes. One class is their base class, one class is inherited from their father, and one class is inherited from their mother. And what class they inherit from each parent is determined by a priority order. The child first attempts to inherit their parent's primary class, and if they are unable to, they then attempt to inherit their parent's secondary class, i.e. the thing you can access via Heart Seal. If they are unable to do that either, they then attempt to inherit the parallel class to their parent's primary class. Each class in Fire Emblem Fates has a parallel class attached to it. Usually this is the Nourian and Hoshiden equivalents. For example, the parallel class to Fighter is Oni Savage, and the parallel class to Mercenary is Samurai. Getting back to class inheritance, the third class that a child tries to inherit is their parent's primary class's parallel class. And if they are unable to do that, then the fourth class that they attempt to inherit is their parent's secondary class's parallel class. If all four of these checks fail, they do not inherit any class from that parent. But outside of using mods or randomizer situations, you're never going to run into the issue where all four of these checks fail. Now, for some reason, presumably because the majority of fixed parents are fathers, children will always inherit classes from their father before they inherit classes from their mother. In 99% of cases, this doesn't actually affect anything, but specifically in the case of Azura marrying Jakob, it affects Shigure. Shigure's base class set is Sky Knight, so he already owns Sky Knight before any parental inheritance. He then looks to Jakob and sees that Jakob's base class set is the Troubadour line, and as a result of that, he inherits the Troubadour line from Jakob. Then he looks to Azura. Azura's base class set is Songstress, and that cannot be inherited by children. As a result of that, Shigure then looks to Azura's secondary class, which is Sky Knight. Because Shigure's base class is Sky Knight, he cannot inherit Sky Knight from Azura, so he looks to the parallel class for Songstress, which is Troubadour. But because he already inherited Troubadour from Jakob, he is unable to inherit it from Azura. And as a result of this, he looks to the parallel class to her Heartseal class, which is Wyvern. This is the only way to pass the Wyvern skill on to Shigure. Even Corrin can't give it to him as a father, as Corrin passes the Nor Noble line down to his children. Theoretically, you could have Shigure marry either Corrin or Kana, but if you want it in his base kit, Jakob's the way to go. And while Jakob definitely isn't doing Shigure's stats any favors, Shigure's bases are strong enough alongside decent growths that he doesn't mind too much, especially since if you're doing Jakob Shigure, you're probably aiming towards making him into a Rallybot rather than a primary combat unit. You see, the Wyvern Lord class gives Shigure rally defense, which complements his rally speed from Falco Knight and rally resistance from Strategist, alongside his personal skill, Perfect Pitch, which causes the rally command to heal allies within 2 spaces for 10% of their HP total if they have less HP than Shigure. These 4 skills can combine to turn Shigure into a very competent defensive rally bot, especially if you factor in Jakob's ability to pass down either inspiration or Amaterasu to his son. And if you're really invested in utility Shigure, he does have some marriage and friendship options to help with this, although that is a topic better covered in Shigure's own video. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel if you're interested in an extended Shigure discussion, because it is upcoming. But pivoting back to Jakob, it is pretty neat that he has a legitimate niche as a father, especially since with Azura being such an early joiner, if you want to confine your Jakob deployment to the early game, it's very feasible to achieve this marriage and then shelve the Butler for good. Which, cards on the table, I tend to think Jakob is at his best as a low investment early game only unit. But okay, now that we've looked at the few instances of Jakob as a father, I do want to take a look at how his support ranks can impact the first generation. Because unlike Felicia, he doesn't really have a clear case of a support partner who desperately wants his bonuses. It's nice that he can provide the crit avoid just like she can, but this is hardly unique. We've only talked about 2 units attack stance bonuses in this series so far, and both of them offer crit avoid. And Jakob's personal guard stance bonuses are kind of in conflict with the bonuses offered by the Butler class. Butler gives 2 magic, 3 speed, and 3 luck, and while Jakob does offer a point of speed at B support, his other bonuses are to strength and skill. And there are very few units who care both about their magic and strength stat. Most focus on one or the other for their offensive prowess. Don't get me wrong, there are some high investment builds that can use both attacking types, but by the time you get those builds online, is Butler Jakob really going to be the best backpack for them? Now, you could alleviate this problem and use a Heart Seal to reclass him into Great Knight, therefore offering a combination of defense, strength, and movement alongside the strength, speed, and skill from his personals. But at that point, you spend a Heart Seal on a backpack. And sure, Heart Seals are more common in Rev than the other routes, but there's also far more targets who want multiple Heart Seals. Because of Evasive Partner, the temptation is to slap him on Corrin in order to give the extra bulk, speed, and strength. And if you're keeping Corrin in the Noble class line, she can benefit from the magic as well, because the Dragonstone uses magic and the swords use strength. But at that point, Great Knight Gunter is going to provide more for you anyway. Thanks to Forceful Partner, Gunter immediately gives 5 strength, 3 magic, and 4 defense, whereas Jakob is only giving 2 strength, 2 magic, and 4 speed at S support. But here's the thing, as dire as this comparison sounds, it doesn't really matter. Jakob is a pretty abysmal backpack in the early game, but Azura also doesn't provide much for you as a backpack, and nobody penalizes her for it. Jakob should be doing combat early on, it's what he's best at. Leave backpack duty to units like Hana and Rinka. Before wrapping up the discussion on Jakob, I want to talk about his late appearance, because if you chose Felicia first, Jakob will arrive to the My Castle in between chapters 15 and 16. Ready to go as a level 13 Butler. Chapter 13 is where the difficulty of Rev really starts ramping up, and if you take a look at Jakob's stats, it should be immediately obvious that he is not suited for the battlefield. His staff rank and shuriken rank are auto-leveled to C each, so he can use some healing staffs if you want. C rank is notable because it gives access to the long-range staffs, Physic and Wayne Festal, alongside a pair of offensive staffs, Silence and Enfeeble. So if you haven't been raising a staffer, Jakob can do some utility work for you. But with early Felicia under your belt, you almost certainly have a more magically inclined staffer. Her hit rate's going to be better with the offensive staffs, and the amount of HP she heals is going to be higher with the healing staffs. Although it is worth noting, the Fates healing formula is magic divided by 3, so it's not a huge difference. What is huge is that the early servant, Felicia in this case, has had time to build supports and learn level 15 skills, which Jakob has not. And while a late Felicia deployment can be justified based on her support prospects with Leo, as well as her ability to just instantly reclass to strategist and be fine, a late Jakob just does not have the same prospects she does. His biggest boon is that he is only 2 levels away from gaining a level 15 skill. But because he hasn't built any support ranks, he has to choose between the skills from the Troubadour line or those from the Cavalier line, and of those, the only one that's super impactful is Inspiration, which, again, you already could have had on early Felicia, and potentially even her child. It's funny because at the same time that Jakob becomes available, you are handed 6 additional low-tier scrubs, but all of them have at least one advantage over him. Like, sure, they can't immediately get level 15 skills, but I'd rather start with Quick Draw than be 2 levels away from Aegis. Late Recruit Jakob is truly a tragic unit. Now, as a paid member of the woke mob, I would be remiss in my duty if I didn't talk to you about the mechanical benefits of being transgender. And as much as that sounds like a non sequitur joke, it's not. There are mechanical advantages and disadvantages to transing Corrin's gender, and it primarily impacts Jakob and Felicia. So the first 5 chapters of Fire Emblem Fates are the same across all 3 routes, and serve as a tutorial to the game's mechanics. During that time period, you have control of Corrin, Gunter, Sakura, Kaze, Azura, Rinka, and the First Servant. And whatever levels and stat increases these characters get are actually remembered and saved when the game creates what is known as a Branch of Fate file. The Branch of Fate allows you to create a brand new character and start at Chapter 6. The purpose of this is to let you skip the tutorial if you've already learned how the mechanics work. But because one of the units that you can level up in Branch of Fate is the Early Servant, by changing Corrin's gender, you can change what level the Early and Late Servant arrive at. This doesn't have a ton of applications, but you can do some neat stuff with it. For example, since you're getting a lot of experience on your Early Servant in Chapter 7, if you want to maximize the number of levels that Jakob gets with Paladin or Great Knight growths, you can do the prologue with Felicia and then trans Corrin's gender to end up with a level 1 Jakob in the early game. Alternatively, this can be used to manipulate the level and experience that a late servant arrives at, which is particularly helpful if you want to inherit specific high-level skills. If you give either Jakob or Felicia 2 levels in Branch of Fate and then trans Corrin's gender, they will join already having learned Tome Fair. Meanwhile, if you edge them by giving them 1 level and 90-ish experience, they will be 10 experience away from a level up, and you can then reclass them into whatever promoted class you wish to gain a skill from. Because the Late Servant hasn't had the opportunity to build supports, you are limited in what skills you can do this for, and generally I think it's a strategy that's more useful in the other 2 routes, Birthright and Conquest. Even there though, it's the sort of thing that's most useful for highly niche challenge runs. But it is a cool interaction between the mechanics, and if you're doing a run where you want to use the Late Servant, it's something worth considering at least. But now to answer the question posed in the video's thumbnail. Which of these 3 servants is the Jagen of Fire Emblem Fates Revelation? And personally, my pick is Jakob. He has incredibly strong combat at what I consider to be the true start of the game, Chapter 9, due to a combination of his hidden weapons, his natural overleveling, and his use of promoted class bases and growths. However, because his personal growths are so piss poor, he will fall off in the medium to long term if not given special attention. While there are builds that can bring him into late game viability, they are so high investment that they feel like fighting against the tide. Not too dissimilar from the Hurricane Axe Mage Knight builds of Vander. Modern Fire Emblem just gives you the tools to fix whatever unit you want, and that includes the game's Jagens. While Felicia and Gunter have some traits that do make them allude to Jagen status, ultimately I don't think either of them can fit the role. Felicia does require a heart seal in order to truly feel like she has strong early game combat in the strategist class line. And Gunter does have decent combat, but it's not significantly better than his peers, and he's much more suited to a utility role even in the beginning of the game, requiring some training himself to reach this point. Honestly, there's a decent argument for Corrin being the Jagen over Felicia and Gunter, although I think Jakob's mediocre scaling cement him in the role pretty cleanly. But who's the Jagen wasn't the only thing this video wanted to determine. After all, the secondary goal of this series is to place all of these units on a tier list. So here are my placements for the 5 units we talked about today. That being Gunter, early Jakob, early Felicia, late Felicia, and late Jakob. I have early Jakob in A tier because in addition to assisting in Chapter 7 and 8, I think his combat in the Chapters 9 through 12 stretch is extremely appreciated. Without asking for any special investment, he does the early game Jagen thing perfectly, carrying the team until your army is strong enough that they no longer need him. And if you want to invest in him, he can pivot in the mid-game into a utility role that will be useful for the rest of the campaign. Although there is no need to do this if you don't want to. He can just live as a zero investment Jagen and still be incredibly valuable. I have early Felicia on the other hand straddling the line between A tier and B tier. I think she's either at the very bottom of A tier or the very top of B tier, and so here I put her in B, but as the tier list fills out, that is subject to change. Without an early Heart Seal, Felicia really is just a utility unit, and you already have a couple of strong utility units. What your army really needs early on is more combat. And even as a strategist, I don't necessarily think Felicia has better combat than Jakob. She deals more damage than him, but she also is significantly frailer. Still, in early game, your army is in pretty dire straits, so Felicia's ability to do anything useful is quite valuable, and I don't want to discount her incredibly high investment builds either. Personally, I think there are quite a few other options for high investment who will have more payoff than Felicia, but Felicia at the very least offers some unique stuff. I have late Felicia at the bottom of B tier or the top of C tier. Again, her placement is subject to move as the tier list fills out. I think that the utility she offers for free is valuable. The only Generation 1 staffers she's really competing with are early Jakob, Sakura, and Elise. She pretty handily beats Elise in the staff utility department, and unless you've done a high investment utility Jakob, late Felicia is going to be better than your Jakob at staffing as well. The only person who really competes with her is Sakura, but Sakura has a lot of builds she could go for, and most of them don't involve her retaining access to rods. Combine this with late Felicia just low-key being one of Leo's better pair-up partners, and you end up with a unit who a lot of teams can really justify deploying. Gunter I have pretty solidly in C tier, and I suspect he'll end up in the middle of the bunch of C tier characters. I do think that his early shelter utility as well as access to rally defense are huge boons, and Forceful Partner makes him one of Corrin's best backpacks in the short term. But the lack of supports and the piss poor growths mean that he has an expiration date, and it's generally sooner rather than later. I'm also really not a fan of how to get the most out of Gunter, you have to sink a Heart Seal into him. Especially as oftentimes that Heart Seal is only rewarding for like 3 more chapters. And low-key, training him in Chapter 8 to get rally defense in time for Mozu Paralog in Chapter 9 is actually kind of painful. His experience gain is faster than you would expect, but he still needs to secure quite a few kills, and oftentimes with very shaky hit rates. Something like 70 and 80% is not really where you want to be. Chapter 8 also has a few archers, so if you're training him in Wyvern, he has to watch out lest he be one-shot. Jagen my ass. And lastly, in the F tier, I have late Jakob, represented by the Rainbow Sage. Late Jakob has all of the downsides of late Felicia with none of the upsides. His ability to get level 15 skills is nice on the surface, but until he support routes, which skills he gets are quite limited. And his combat is so mediocre that even getting him the levels to gain those skills is going to be an uphill battle. Combine that with the fact that he can't even pretend he's a good backpack or a good staffer, and there really isn't a good reason to deploy early Jakob. He's not the worst unit in the game, but he's pretty darn close. But with that out of the way, I think we've just about closed the book on Corrin's retainers. I'm curious about your thoughts on these three units, especially Jakob and Felicia are really interesting and open up a bunch of play possibilities that no other unit can do. So much so that there's surely something I didn't cover in this video, so let me know your favorite way to use the servants. On top of that, I'm curious to hear what you feel about my tiering placements, especially people who have experience with Revelation. What would you change and why? Like I said, some of these units may move slightly as the list fills out. It's always awkward placing people when everything is empty, but whether they remain in the same tiers, I am confident in the order of the characters I have, in terms of who's best and who's worst. As for the rest of the series going forward, I wanted to talk about Corrin and their retainers first in the series, but now that I've got the 4 of them out of the way, I don't necessarily want to limit myself to going in recruitment order. And instead, I've opened up polls to my Patreons to decide on who I should cover next. If you're interested in helping me choose, there is a link below where you can access that poll, as well as get your name in the credits and some other cool benefits, but please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem. With that being said, I should probably thank my current Patreons. So, thank you to Eris, Michael Kraus, Len, Gameboo, Karosa, Fyrant, Smaz Ruby, Zycrum, Robin D, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Calamity Callie, Thaythom, Andu, Reflect, a clever username of lies, YLO1, George Grenville, the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Arvis, Tailored Muffin, Flo Ahay, Faulty Videos, Gabe the Green, Control Dages, Roman Kormansic, Nick Knack Hammersmack, SUP, Caius Cole, Bell Wenska, Dysike, Ginger, Root Beer Pants, Queen Eliza, Aerith Emblem, Adele, and especially my Jagens, Justin Robinson, Kyle Madison, Autumn Kelsey, and Lilzabeth. Today's comment code word is billionaire, so include billionaire in your comment if you made it to the end, so I know you watched the entire video. And with that, I'm going to have to say, have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.